The day Della Baker rode into Redemption Creek with nothing but a carpetbag, a loaded derringer, and a heart full of stubborn hope, the whole town stopped to stare, and not one of them expected her to last a week. The year was 1873, and Redemption Creek, Texas sat like a sun-baked blister on the edge of the Llano Estacado, the kind of place that chewed up newcomers and spat them out bleached and broken. The main street was a strip of packed dirt flanked by a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with a warped sign that read the Silver Spur, and a sheriff's office that looked like it had given up on itself sometime around 1868. The wind carried red dust everywhere. Into your eyes, your teeth, your boots, and the sky overhead was the particular shade of blue that only exists in Texas in late June, hard and bright, and indifferent as a poker player's face. Della was 23 years old, with copper-brown hair pinned under a straw hat that had seen better days, green eyes that could go from warm to flint in a single breath, and hands that were already toughened from years of keeping house for her father up in Abilene before cholera took him in the spring. She had no family left, a total of $11.40 to her name, and a letter from a woman named Mrs. Prudence Holt, who had advertised in the Abilene Chronicle for a seamstress and housekeeper at reasonable wages. The letter had promised steady pay, decent lodging, and respectable company. Della had read it 3 times before packing her bag. What the letter had not mentioned was that Mrs. Prudence Holt had passed away from a heart complaint 2 weeks before Della's arrival, leaving her house, her debts, and her advertisement dangling in the air like a rope with nothing tied to it. Della discovered this fact the moment she stepped down from the stagecoach and asked the man sweeping the porch of the general store where she might find the Holt residence. He pushed back his hat, squinted at her with the expression of a man being asked to deliver bad news he hadn't personally caused, and told her, plain and simple, that Prudence Holt was in the ground behind the Methodist church. Della stood very still for a moment, the dust settling around her boots, the sun pressing down on her hat brim, and she thought about crying. She decided against it. Crying wouldn't conjure $11.40 into enough to buy a stagecoach ticket back to Abilene, and even if it could, there was nothing in Abilene waiting for her. So instead she squared her shoulders, picked up her carpetbag, and walked into the Silver Spur saloon not to drink, but because she had noticed a handwritten notice in the window that said help wanted in uneven letters. The inside of the Silver Spur smelled like tobacco, whiskey, sawdust, and about 40 years of accumulated regret. A piano sat against the far wall, unplayed and slightly out of tune. Behind the bar, a round-faced woman named Mee Gibbons was pulling glasses from a wooden crate and setting them in a row with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. Della introduced herself, explained her situation with admirable brevity, and asked about the notice in the window. Mee looked her over the way you'd assess a horse not unkindly, but thoroughly, and said she needed someone to cook, keep the back rooms clean, and help with laundry. The pay was $4 a month, a cot in the back storeroom, and meals. It wasn't what Della had imagined when she left Abilene, but it was something solid to stand on while she figured out what came next. She took the job. She had been in Redemption Creek exactly 4 days when she first saw Albert Chandler. He rode in from the north on a bay mare named Clover, leading a second horse loaded with surveying equipment measuring chains, a compass, a wooden tripod, and a leather satchel full of papers that flapped at the edges in the hot wind. He was 30 years old, lean in the way that men who work outdoors get lean, with dark hair gone a little long under a battered brown hat, and a jaw that carried about 3 days of stubble and looked like it had been set by someone who meant business. His eyes were the color of strong coffee and carried in them a quality that Della would later struggle to name. It wasn't exactly kindness, and it wasn't exactly sadness, though it had elements of both. It was more like the look of a man who had been paying very close attention to the world for a long time and had a great many opinions about what he'd seen. He tied Clover to the post in front of the general store, pulled off his gloves, and walked inside. Della noticed him from across the street, where she was hanging laundry on a line strung between two posts at the side of the saloon. She noticed him the way you notice the weather changing, not necessarily with pleasure or alarm, but with the instinctive awareness that something in the atmosphere had shifted. She did not think about him again for the rest of that afternoon. She was too busy. Albert Chandler was a land surveyor working on contract for the Texas General Land Office, tasked with mapping and formally recording the boundaries of several contested ranch properties in the region around Redemption Creek. It was painstaking, solitary work, and he had been at it for 7 months, moving from town to town across West Texas with his instruments and his horses and his methodical patience. He had grown up in Tennessee, studied mathematics and engineering at a small college in Nashville, and come west at 24 after a failed engagement to a woman named Charlotte Marsh, who had decided, with impeccable timing and minimal sentimentality, that she preferred the stable prospects of a banker's son to the uncertain future of a man who wanted to spend his life measuring the open land. Albert had never quite gotten over Charlotte Marsh, not because he was still in love with her. He had accepted long ago that what they'd had was more habit than passion, but because the episode had left him with a deep, persistent wariness about his own judgment where the heart was concerned. He had decided, somewhere in the long, quiet miles between one Texas town and the next, that he was not a man cut out for the kinds of feelings that led to that particular variety of disappointment. He was good at his work. He was honest. He was careful. And he kept to himself, which suited most people just fine and suited him even better. He got a room at the small boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Farrell, who served breakfast at 7 and expected guests to be quiet after 9 in the evening. He ate his first dinner in Redemption Creek alone at a table in the Silver Spur, and that was where he encountered Della Baker for the second time. She brought him a plate of beef stew and cornbread without asking what he wanted, because that was the only supper Me was serving that evening, and she set it in front of him with a brisk efficiency that communicated without words that she was busy and he should not require much additional attention. He said, "Thank you," in a quiet voice, and something in the genuine simplicity of it made Della glance at him a second longer than she intended. "You just passing through?" she asked, because in Redemption Creek that was the most natural question in the world to ask a stranger, and also because she was genuinely curious, and Della had never been particularly good at pretending otherwise. "Could be a few weeks," Albert said. "I'm surveying property out east of town, Henderson Ranch, Bower Parcel, and a stretch of unclaimed land that several parties seem to feel entitled to." Della raised an eyebrow. "That would be the stretch that Harlan Cole and Samuel Briggs have been arguing about since before I arrived." Albert looked at her with slight surprise. "You've been here less than a week by my count." "I pay attention," Della said simply, and went back to the kitchen. Albert ate his stew and thought about that for a while. Over the next few days, he came in for dinner every evening, and Della brought him his food with the same no-nonsense efficiency, but they began to talk. First about small things, the weather, the state of the road east, whether Me's cornbread was better with or without molasses, a question on which they turned out to hold opposite and strongly defended views. Then about larger things, the way conversations will naturally migrate when two intelligent people find themselves in each other's company with some regularity. Albert discovered that Della had come from Abilene, that her father had been a tailor, and had taught her everything he knew about precise, careful work, and that she had a very sharp mind and absolutely no patience for dishonesty in any form. Della discovered that Albert was quietly funny in a dry way that crept up on you, that he could explain the mathematics of land measurement in terms clear enough that she actually found herself interested, and that beneath the careful, composed exterior, there was a quality of loneliness so habitual it had become almost invisible, like a piece of furniture you stop seeing because it's always been in the same corner. She recognized it because she had it too. 10 days after Albert's arrival in Redemption Creek, the trouble with the Henderson Ranch survey began in earnest, and it changed the comfortable, careful distance between Albert and Della in ways neither of them had anticipated. The situation was this. Harlan Cole was a rancher of the old school, which is to say he was accustomed to the idea that land was his if he could hold it, and formal legal boundaries were an inconvenience invented by people who had never tried to run cattle on the open range. He had been using a stretch of the unclaimed land east of town for 3 years, running his herd across it as though it were his own. The new land survey would establish, with legal precision and documented evidence, where the Henderson Ranch ended and where the unclaimed parcel began, and if Albert's measurements held, which they would, because Albert's measurements always held, Cole would lose access to several hundred acres of good grazing land. Cole had made it known through the usual channels, which in Redemption Creek meant loudly, in the Silver Spur, with a whiskey in his hand, that he did not intend to accept that outcome. Albert was not particularly concerned. He had dealt with men like Cole before, stubborn and territorial and loud as a summer thunderstorm, who usually backed down once the legal documents were filed, and the sheriff, even a tired, dispirited sheriff like the one Redemption Creek employed, was willing to enforce them. He went about his work with his usual methodical calm, rising early, riding out to the survey site, taking his measurements, recording them in his precise and tiny handwriting, and returning to town in the evenings. On the 11th day of the survey, he came back to find that someone had ridden through his stake lines and pulled up 3 of his boundary markers. He spent the following morning re-establishing them, and when he came in for dinner that evening, there was a tight, controlled anger around his eyes that Della noticed immediately. "Cole," she asked, setting down his plate. Albert looked at her steadily. "I didn't see it happen." "You didn't need to," Della said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll have the survey finished and the documentation filed in Abilene within 3 weeks. Once it's filed, the markers don't matter. And between now and 3 weeks?" Della asked. Albert picked up his fork. "I'll manage." Della leaned one hand on the table edge and looked at him with an expression that was not quite skepticism and not quite concern, but occupied the territory between them. "You should let the sheriff know what happened." "I will. Tonight, not tomorrow." Albert looked up at her with a flicker of something that might have been amusement and might have been the beginning of admiration. "You're bossy for a person who's been in town less than 2 weeks." "I'm efficient," Della said. "For a person who learned it from her father, who learned it from 20 years of running a tailor shop in Abilene, where nothing happened on schedule unless you made it happen." She straightened up. "Molasses with the cornbread tonight." "No," Albert said firmly. "You're wrong about that," Della told him, and went back to the kitchen. Albert went to the sheriff that evening. It didn't accomplish a great deal. Sheriff Tate was a man of limited energy who had been waiting out his days until he could retire to his sister's place in San Antonio, and he promised to have a word with Cole without any great conviction that it would change anything. But Albert had done what he could through proper channels, and that was how he operated. What changed things, or rather, what cracked open the careful, professional distance between Albert and Della, happened 3 days later, on a Saturday afternoon when Della had her half-day off. She had spent the morning walking the edge of town, learning its geography the way she learned everything, systematically and with attention. She had found, on the far east side, a stand of cottonwood trees along a thin creek that was nearly dry in the summer heat, but still offered shade, and a whisper of moving water, and a quality of quiet that was hard to find in the rest of Redemption Creek. She had brought a book, one of the 3 she had managed to carry in her carpetbag, a well-worn copy of Jane Eyre that had been her mother's, and she was sitting with her back against one of the cottonwoods, reading, when she heard horses. 2 of them moving at a purposeful pace through the scrub to the north, and then voices, one she recognized immediately as Albert's, level and deliberate, and one that was rougher and louder, and carried the particular tone of a man who was used to making his volume do the work his arguments couldn't. She stood up, shading her eyes, and saw them through the thin screen of brush. Albert on Clover, his surveying equipment packed on the second horse, and across from him, blocking the narrow track, a heavy-set man on a gray horse. That would be Harlan Cole. Beside Cole were two ranch hands who said nothing but sat their horses in the slightly forward posture of men who were waiting for a signal. "I'm telling you plain," Cole was saying, "that survey don't mean a damn thing in this county unless I say it does." "It means something to the Texas General Land Office," Albert replied, "and to the law, which I suspect will hold a higher opinion of documented measurements than of what you say it does. Smart mouth for a man who's got a long ride back to town and no company." "I'll manage," Albert said, with a calm that struck Della as either genuine or extraordinarily well performed. She couldn't be sure which. She stepped forward out of the cottonwoods into the open and said clearly, "Good afternoon, Mr. Cole." All four men turned. Cole's eyes narrowed. The ranch hands exchanged a glance. Albert looked at her with an expression that combined surprise, exasperation, and something else she didn't take the time to identify. "Miss Baker," Cole said, after a pause that established he knew who she was. In a town the size of Redemption Creek, everyone knew who everyone was within 48 hours. "This is no business of yours." "I was sitting in the shade reading a book," Della said pleasantly, "and I couldn't help overhearing. I imagine my employer, Mrs. Gibbons, and most of the people in town would also be interested to hear about this conversation, given that Mr. Chandler is here on behalf of the Texas Land Office, which carries the authority of the state." She said it the same way she set down plates, matter-of-factly, without drama, as though it were simply the most obvious thing in the world. It was the calm of it that had the effect, she thought later. Not the words so much as the utter absence of fear in the way she delivered them. Cole looked at her for a long moment, then looked at Albert, then made a sound in his throat that communicated a grudging retreat packaged as disdain, and pulled his horse aside. He and his men rode east without another word, though Cole's back communicated a great deal as he went. Albert walked Clover up to where Della was standing, and for a moment he just looked at her. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said. "I know," Della agreed. "I'm still deciding which." Something shifted in his expression then, something careful and guarded, moving fractionally aside to let through a warmth that seemed almost involuntary, the way sunlight comes through a gap in storm clouds, briefly and brilliantly, and as if it hadn't quite meant to. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it the way he'd meant it the first time, simply and completely. They walked back toward town together, Albert leading Clover and the pack horse, Della with her book tucked under her arm, and they talked for nearly an hour about everything and nothing, and the distance between them was different after that. Less careful, less managed, as though something had been established in the shade of those cottonwood trees that didn't need to be said aloud to be understood. That evening Albert stayed later than usual at the Silver Spur, long after the dinner crowd had thinned out to a handful of men playing cards in the corner, and the piano player working his way through a slow, sighing waltz. Della came and sat across from him when me released her from the kitchen duties, and they drank coffee, neither of them being particular drinkers, and talked until the piano player finally packed up and went home. Albert told her about Tennessee, about the college, about Charlotte Marsh, with a brevity and honesty that suggested he had not told that story to many people, and was somewhat surprised to find himself telling it now. Della listened without interrupting, which she was not always able to manage, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment and then said, "She was a fool." Albert looked at her. "Not because she chose someone else," Della clarified. "People's hearts go where they go, and that's their right. A fool because she apparently never saw past the uncertainty to the man underneath it. That's the more interesting part, and she missed it." Albert was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the street, stirring dust, and a dog barked once and was silent. "You see people very clearly," he said. My father used to say that measuring twice and cutting once is as important in understanding people as it is in tailoring, Della said. I've tried to live by that. And what do you see when you measure me? Albert asked, and the question was so direct and so quietly vulnerable that it seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. Della considered him across the table. The lamplight caught the planes of his face, the careful lines around his eyes, the particular set of his mouth that was both firm and gentle. A man who is better at being alone than he thinks he is, she said, and worse at it than he wants to be. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need filling. Albert walked her to the back door of the saloon, her door, the one that led to the storeroom where she slept, and said good night with a formality that was clearly the product of effort, the conscious reassertion of that careful distance. But he paused on the step and looked back at her once, and in the moonlight his expression had none of the usual management in it. She dreamed about cottonwood trees and the smell of paper and measuring chains. The survey was completed at the end of the following week. Albert filed the documentation with the county clerk and sent copies north to Abilene for the state records, and the legal boundary of the Henderson Ranch and the unclaimed parcel was now a matter of official record, which meant that Harlan Cole's claim on the eastern grazing land was worth exactly nothing in a court of law. Cole received this news badly, but quietly, which was somehow more concerning than noise would have been. Sheriff Tate told Albert, with the air of a man delivering information he had no intention of acting upon, that Cole had been heard to say some things at the spur that he wouldn't repeat in mixed company. Albert listened, thanked him, and went back to his room at Mrs. Farrell's to write his report. He should, by his original plan, have been ready to move on within a day or two. His contract with the land office had him scheduled for a survey along the Double Fork Creek some 40 miles to the southeast, and the schedule was already running behind because of the trouble with Cole's interference. He had his equipment packed. Mrs. Farrell's bill was settled. He did not leave. He told himself it was because he had some additional notes to complete for the Henderson survey. This was partially true. The other part of the truth was that he sat at the desk in his room at Mrs. Farrell's with his notes in front of him and thought about Della Baker with a frequency and a particularity that was inconsistent with the behavior of a man who was simply good at being alone. He thought about the set of her chin when she was making a point. He thought about the way she laughed rarely, but when she did, it was real, the kind of laugh that didn't perform itself. He thought about her hands moving efficiently over the work of the kitchen, the same precision that must have run in her family, inherited from a father who measured twice and cut once. He thought about the moment she had stepped out of those cottonwood trees and faced down Harlan Cole with nothing but a calm voice and the plain truth, and the way something in his chest had done something it hadn't done in a very long time. On his third morning of not leaving, he went to the Silver Spur at an hour when he knew Della would be doing the breakfast setup, and he sat at the counter and said, without preamble, that he wondered if she might want to walk with him out to the Henderson property that morning, since the weather was tolerable and there was something out there he thought she might find interesting. Della looked at him over a stack of plates she was carrying. "Something interesting," she repeated. "There's a section of the creek that still has water in it," Albert said. "Real water, not just dry bed. And there's a natural spring about a quarter-mile north that feeds it. I found it during the survey. I thought you might like to see it since you seem to enjoy the creek east of town." Della set down the plates and considered him with the measuring look that he had come to recognize as her most honest expression, the one she wore when she was actually thinking something through rather than performing the consideration. "Let me ask me," she said. Me, who had been listening to this exchange from behind the kitchen door with the complete absence of shame common to innkeepers and saloon owners the world over, called out that Della could have the morning. They rode out together on Clover and the pack horse, Della riding astride in a way that she had learned as a child and never apologized for, with her green eyes bright, and the straw hat tied firmly against the prairie wind. Albert rode beside her, and they talked about the land as they crossed it, the geology of the Llano Estacado, the way the soil changed from the red clay near town to the sandier composition further east, the surprising variety of plants that managed to survive at this edge of the dry season. Albert knew the land the way a surveyor knows it, in terms of slope and mineral composition and legal boundary, but Della saw other things: a hawk riding the thermals above the escarpment, a line of wildflowers following the ghost of an underground water seam, the way the light changed the color of the grass as the clouds moved. "You see things I don't see," Albert said, not as a compliment but as a fact he was observing. "You see things I don't see either," Della said. "That's how it usually works with people, I think. You fit together what you each notice and you get something closer to the whole picture." Albert was quiet for a moment, looking out across the rolling grass and the wide, empty sky. "I think you might be the most direct person I've ever met," he said. "My father was direct," Della said. "He thought it was the kindest thing you could be in the long run, less time wasted, less misunderstanding. He sounds like a remarkable man." "He was," Della said simply, and there was something in the simplicity that honored the loss without drowning in it. They found the spring Albert had told her about, a seep of clear, cold water out of a limestone shelf, filling a small basin before running off to join the creek. Cottonwoods grew around it and a few willows, and in the shade it was cooler by 10 degrees than the open land, and the sound of the water was the best sound in that entire dry county. Della cupped her hands and drank from it, and looked up at Albert with an expression of pure, uncomplicated pleasure that he found he wanted to remember exactly as it was, the way you want to remember something you know you might only see once. He sat on the limestone ledge, and she sat a little below him on the bank, and they were quiet together in the way that is its own kind of conversation, the comfortable silence of two people who have passed the point where silence is uncomfortable. "Are you going to stay in Redemption Creek?" Albert asked. Della tilted her head, trailing her fingers in the water. "I don't know yet. I like the work well enough. But I don't think it's permanent." She paused. "Where do you go next?" "Double Fork Creek, southeast of here, about 40 miles. And after that? I don't know. The contracts come from Abilene. I go where they send me." Della looked at him. He was watching the water, his hat resting on the stone beside him, his hair slightly disordered by the ride. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent so long moving from one assignment to the next that he had stopped imagining there might be another kind of life. "Does it suit you?" she asked. "The moving?" Albert considered this with the seriousness he brought to things that deserved it. "It suits the work," he said. "Whether it suits me is a question I haven't looked at very closely." "Maybe you should," Della said. He looked at her then, and the coffee-colored eyes had in them everything she had been carefully not naming for the past 2 weeks. The warmth she'd first caught a glimpse of in the moonlight outside her door, the particular quality of attention that felt like being seen rather than merely looked at, and beneath that, the cautious, wondering quality of a man who had spent a long time protecting himself from hope and was now finding the effort surprisingly exhausting. "Miss Baker," he said. "Della," she corrected. "Della." He said her name the way you say the name of something you've decided to stop being afraid of. "I want to tell you something plainly because I think that's what you deserve, and because I've been trying to find the right moment for the better part of a week, and I'm starting to think there isn't a right moment, only the moment that you take." "Then take it," Della said. "I find myself in the position of not wanting to leave Redemption Creek," Albert said. "Or more precisely, in the position of not wanting to leave and then ride 40 miles southeast and spend the next several months wondering what would have happened if I'd said something before I went." Della's fingers stilled in the water. "I am aware," he continued, with the careful precision of a man who has measured this twice and is now cutting, "that I have known you for less than 3 weeks, and that it might seem hasty, and that I have a demonstrated history of poor judgment where matters of the heart are concerned. But I don't think this is poor judgment. I think this is the clearest I've seen anything in a long time." Della sat very still for a moment, looking at the water where her fingers rested. Then she looked up at him. "Albert," she said, "I have been in Redemption Creek for 2.5 weeks. I have no family, modest savings, a temporary job in a saloon, and a carpetbag that represents the entirety of my worldly possessions. On paper, I'm not anyone's most sensible prospect." "I'm not looking at paper," Albert said. "No," Della said softly. "I don't think you are." She stood up from the bank and stepped closer to him, and he stood too, almost reflexively, because it was the kind of moment that required it. They were close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, close enough that she could see the rise and fall of his breathing, slightly less steady than usual. "I think," Della said, "that you should finish your survey at Double Fork Creek. I think that's the honest and responsible thing to do, and I don't have any interest in a man who would abandon his obligations." Albert blinked. "That's not, but I also think," Della continued, "that when you come back, and you should come back, we should see what this is." She met his eyes steadily. "Because I think you might be the most careful man I've ever met in all the good senses of the word, and that is not a common thing, and I do not intend to treat it carelessly." Albert looked at her for a long moment, and then the careful, composed face did something she hadn't seen it do before. It broke open into a smile. Not the small, controlled near smile he'd offered occasionally over the past weeks, but a real one, wide and warm and almost surprised by itself, like a window thrown open after a long winter. He reached out and took her hand, and held it in both of his with the careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything, and said, "I will come back." "I know," Della said, and she did. The weeks that Albert was away at the Double Fork Creek survey were not easy ones, but they were not empty ones either. Della threw herself into her work with the focused energy of a woman who has something worth working toward, which is a different quality of effort than simply keeping busy. She helped me reorganize the back rooms of the saloon, making them cleaner and more orderly than they had ever been. She took on mending and sewing for several women in town who had heard about her skills, earning a modest supplement to her wage that she put carefully aside. She wrote a long letter to a cousin in Missouri, and a shorter one to the woman in Abilene who had been her father's neighbor, because it seemed important to maintain the threads of connection she still had. She also did not forget the problem of Harlan Cole. Cole had settled into a simmering, quiet resentment in the weeks since Albert's survey had been filed, and the town had that particular edgy quality that accumulates in small places when everyone knows that someone is not finished being angry. They've simply postponed what they intend to do about it. Sheriff Tate had done nothing more than the minimum, as was his custom. Cole continued to drink at the Silver Spur, but he was different in his drinking, now quieter, watching, the way a man gets when he has stopped reacting and started planning. Della watched him the way her father had taught her to watch a difficult customer, steadily, without making it obvious, and with enough patience to eventually understand what he actually wanted. What Cole actually wanted, she came to understand, was not the land itself, though he wanted that too, but the preservation of a particular idea of himself as a man who could not be told what he could and could not do. The land was a symbol. The survey was a defeat, and the defeat was the thing he couldn't live with. She said as much to me one evening, and me, who was a woman of vast practical wisdom packaged in a comfortable exterior, said, "Smart girl." But knowing why a bull charges doesn't much help you when he's charging at you. "No," Della agreed, "but it tells you where to stand." She was behind the bar helping me with the evening rush when Cole's ranch hand, a thin, weathered young man named Dix, came in and ordered 2 whiskeys and carried them to the table where Cole was sitting, and then Cole raised his glass across the room toward Della with a look that was a statement rather than a toast. Me had the shotgun under the bar. Della had the derringer in her apron pocket. Neither of them moved. Cole left without incident that evening. But the look stayed with Della, and that night she wrote Albert a letter not about Cole specifically, but about the town, about me, about the spring they had found together, and at the end of it, almost as an afterthought that was not an afterthought at all, she wrote, "I miss talking to you in the evenings. I didn't expect to as quickly as this. Come back when your work allows it. She mailed it the following morning and tried not to think too much about whether he would write back. He wrote back within the week. The letter was not long. Albert was not a man of elaborate written expression, but it was precise and warm and told her about the Double Fork Creek survey with the quiet enthusiasm of a man describing something he genuinely loved doing, and at the end it said, "I think about our conversation at the spring. I think about it often. I will be back in Redemption Creek by the middle of August at the latest, and probably sooner." It was, Della thought, exactly the right letter. Not too much, not too little, measured twice, cut once. He arrived on the 9th of August, which was a Wednesday and earlier than she had expected, and she saw him ride down the main street from the window of the general store where she was picking up thread. And the particular way her heart behaved in that moment was information she filed away carefully and considered significant. He came to the Silver Spur that evening, and me set them up at the corner table without being asked, and told Della she could close down the kitchen when she was ready, which was me's way of giving her the evening. They talked for 2 hours. Albert told her about the Double Fork survey, about a dispute he'd had with a local cattleman who tried to bribe him, about a spectacular sunset he'd seen from the top of the escarpment on his last evening there. Della told him about Cole's behavior, about her sewing work, about the letter she'd received from her cousin in Missouri. They fell back into the rhythm of each other with the ease of something that had never really been interrupted, only paused. At the end of the evening, Albert walked her to her door, not the back door of the saloon this time, because Della had moved 3 weeks ago into a small room above the general store that Mrs. Calloway rented out, which was a proper room with a window and a chest of drawers and considerably more dignity than a storeroom cot. He walked her up the outside stairs and stood on the small landing at the top, and the night was cooler than it had been, the first whisper of what would eventually become autumn moving through the dark. He was looking at her in the way he had at the spring, that open, careful look that had nothing managed about it. "Della," he said. "Yes," she said, which was, she supposed, a little premature since he hadn't asked anything yet. But she was her father's daughter, and she preferred to save time when she could. Albert laughed that wide, surprised laugh, and then he stepped close and cupped her face in both hands, which were warm and slightly rough and exactly right, and kissed her with the same quality of deliberate, attentive care that he brought to everything he did, and it was, Della thought, the most honest kiss she had ever received, because it said exactly what it meant. She kissed him back. The following weeks were the beginning of the best thing either of them had experienced in some years, which is to say they were imperfect and complicated, and sometimes frustrating in the way that all honest relationships are. But underneath the imperfection was something solid and real, a foundation laid with the same precision that Albert brought to his surveying work, and the same clear-eyed directness that Della applied to everything she touched. They spent their free time together when Albert was in town, riding out to the spring, walking the edges of the town in the evenings, sitting at the corner table of the Silver Spur with their coffee long after everyone else had gone home. Albert began taking some of his meals with Della at the small kitchen table in the back of Mrs. Calloway's, where Della had gotten permission to use the stove, and he brought her wildflowers from the prairie in a haphazard way that made her laugh because they were never formally presented, just placed on the table as if they'd always been there. She mended his shirts, and he sketched her portrait in the margin of his survey notes. A small, quick sketch that looked more like her than any formal portrait could have, capturing exactly the set of her chin and the brightness of her eyes. The town watched this development with the full-spectrum attention of a small community with limited entertainment, and opinion divided, as it always does, between those who found it lovely and those who found it interesting and those who found it suspicious. Me found it all three and approved of it entirely. Mrs. Farrell said she'd known from the beginning that Mr. Chandler was not the type to stay alone for long. Mrs. Calloway said nothing, but began leaving small dishes of extra food outside Della's door on evenings when Albert came to supper. It was in the middle of September, on a warm afternoon when the light had taken on the golden amber quality of the turning season, that Harlan Cole made his final move. Albert had ridden out that morning to complete some additional notations on the Henderson survey boundary, a small clarification required by the land office that had arrived in the post, and he was working alone at the east property line when Cole rode up with Dix and two other men, and this time the conversation did not have the quality of the first one. This time it was quieter and colder, and Cole had in his eyes the specific flat light of a man who has spent 2 months talking himself into something. He told Albert to write to the land office and say there had been an error in the original survey, that the boundary was 50 yards east of where he'd marked it. Albert told him, with complete and unruffled calm, that there had been no error and that he would write no such letter. Cole said he would find it in his best interest to reconsider. Albert looked at him for a long moment, then looked at the 3 men, then looked back at Cole and said, "I have done this survey with full legal authority and complete accuracy. I will not falsify the record. You may take whatever legal action you believe you have grounds for, and I will answer any challenge through the proper channels." He paused. "But I won't be moved by this kind of conversation." Cole's flat eyes held for another moment, and then something happened that none of them had anticipated. From behind the line of riders, from the direction of the Henderson ranch house a quarter-mile north, came the sound of a horse moving at speed, and then another, and then 3 men from the Henderson operation rode up, the ranch foreman, a compact and weathered man named Garrett, and 2 cowboys who worked the herd, including an enormous man called Boone who handled a rope better than anyone in the county and had arms like 2 fence posts joined at the shoulder. Garrett pulled up and looked at the situation with a quick assessment. "Mr. Chandler," he said, in a tone that made clear he was aware of exactly what was happening. "Mr. Garrett," Albert said evenly. Garrett looked at Cole. "Mr. Henderson asked me to check in on the survey work this morning," he said pleasantly. "Good thing I did, I suppose." Cole looked at the additional riders. He looked at Dix. He looked at his own 2 men who were doing the arithmetic and not liking the results. He looked at Albert one more time with that flat, cold gaze. Then he turned his horse and rode west, and Dix and the other 2 followed, and Garrett watched them go with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Henderson appreciates what you've done," Garrett told Albert. "He wanted you to know that." "I was just doing my job," Albert said. "Some men do their jobs and some men do them right," Garrett said. "Not always the same thing." He touched his hat brim and turned back toward the ranch house, his cowboys following. Albert finished his notations, packed his equipment, and rode back to Redemption Creek. He went directly to the general store, climbed the outside stairs, and knocked on Della's door. She opened it, took one look at his face, and said, "Sit down and tell me," he told her. She listened without interrupting, which cost her more than usual, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Cole won't try again. He's done." "How do you know?" "Because what he wanted was to not be beaten," Della said. "But he was beaten in front of his own men by you not moving an inch and by Garrett showing up with Henderson's backing. There's nothing left for him to win. The smart move is to stop." She paused. "And Cole's not a good man, but he's not a stupid one." Albert looked at her. "You read people the way I read terrain." "Differently," Della said. "But the point is the same, to know where you're standing." Albert leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, and Della recognized this as the gesture he made when he was about to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. "I need to go to Abilene," he said. "The land office wants a meeting about the next contract cycle. They're looking at a significant expansion of survey work in the Panhandle region. It would be a year's work minimum. Good pay." Della waited. "I want to ask you to come with me," Albert said. He looked up. "I'm not going to ask you to follow me around Texas for a year as a companion, because that's not right and it's not what I want. I want to ask you to marry me, Della." And before you tell me that we've known each other for less than 3 months and that's fast, I know that. I know how it sounds." "It doesn't sound fast to me," Della said quietly. Albert blinked. "I am 30, she said. "I have no family. I have been watching you for 3 months with the most careful attention I am capable of, and I have found exactly nothing that gives me pause. You are honest and you are kind and you are the best company I have ever kept." She met his eyes. "My father would have approved of you. He was difficult to satisfy, so I consider that the highest possible reference." Albert stood up, and Della stood too, and he took both her hands in his the way he had at the spring and said, "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," Della said, "obviously." He kissed her, and this time there was in it something more than that first careful declaration. There was relief and joy, and the specific happiness of two people who have been paying careful attention, and have arrived together, at the place they were both quietly heading. They were married in Redemption Creek on the first Saturday of October 1873, in the Methodist Church by the same minister who had buried Prudence Holt, which struck Della as a kind of full circle. Me Gibbons stood up for Della, wearing her best dress and radiating a pleasure so complete it looked almost like a force of nature. Garrett from the Henderson Ranch came, and Mrs. Farrell and Mrs. Calloway and a good portion of the town, because in Redemption Creek a wedding was an event and nobody who was breathing and ambulatory was going to miss it. Della wore a dress she had made herself from blue calico, fitted and clean-lined and exactly right, because she had her father's eye and her father's hands, and she brought them to everything she did. Albert wore his good coat, his best hat, and an expression of such transparent happiness that Mrs. Farrell was heard to say she hadn't seen the like in 15 years. They dined that evening at the Silver Spur, which Me had decorated with wild flowers and paper lanterns with more enthusiasm than precision, and the piano player, who had been asked to stay late and paid an additional $1 for the privilege, played every waltz he knew and then started over when they ran out. Della danced with Albert under the paper lanterns while Me cried with a composure that maintained the fiction that she wasn't crying at all, and the town of Redemption Creek allowed itself, for one evening, to be an entirely uncynical place. They left for Abilene 4 days later on a cool October morning with everything they owned packed between them. Albert's surveying equipment, Della's carpet bag, a second bag she had accumulated, a box of books, and a quilt that Me had given them as a wedding gift, stitched in a pattern of interlocking rings. Albert rode Clover. Della rode the pack horse, whose name was Chester and who turned out to have strong opinions about the pace of travel and an exasperating tendency to stop and investigate anything growing at the side of the road. They spent 3 nights on the road and arrived in Abilene on a Friday, dusty and road-worn and in excellent spirits. Albert went to the land office the following Monday and came back to the room they'd taken at a boarding house with news of the Panhandle contract, substantial, well paid, and involving a team of 2 additional surveyors working under Albert's direction, which meant more responsibility and significantly better compensation. Della spent their first weeks in Abilene establishing herself. She found a small house to rent on the edge of town, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a proper yard, and she negotiated it down from the asking rent with a combination of fiscal precision and complete absence of apology that left the landlord slightly stunned and surprisingly cheerful about the whole outcome. She set up a dressmaking operation in the front room, putting an advertisement in the Abilene Chronicle, the same paper where Prudence Holt's ad had once appeared, which she found quietly amusing, and within 2 weeks she had more work than she could handle. The Panhandle survey contract began in the spring of 1874, and Albert was away for stretches of several weeks at a time, which was not easy but was manageable in the way that things are manageable when you have built something solid to return to. He wrote letters every week, long and detailed in a way that surprised him, because he had not previously considered himself a man who had much to say in letters, and was discovering that what he'd actually lacked was someone worth saying it to. Della wrote back letters of equal length and considerably higher entertainment value, full of the small events of her daily life in Abilene, presented with the dry wit she kept mostly in reserve. When he came home between survey expeditions, they fell into each other's company with the ease of two people who have become genuinely necessary to one another, which is different from and better than the kind of necessity that comes from loneliness. It had, Della sometimes thought, the quality of a well-made piece of work, a shirt cut to fit exactly, a boundary line drawn without error, something made with care to serve its purpose for a long time. In the winter of 1874, Della knew she was pregnant. She told Albert on the evening he came back from the last survey of the season, standing in the kitchen of their rented house while the beans were cooking, because she was her father's daughter, and she saw no reason to dress up information in ceremony when the information itself was sufficient. Albert stood very still in the kitchen doorway for a moment, his hat in his hands, looking at her. "You're certain?" he said. "I measured twice," Della said. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and held her with a care and a fierceness that she hadn't quite expected from him, and she felt him breathe against her hair, and his arms were shaking slightly, and she thought, not for the first time, that the best things about Albert Chandler were not the things he put in words. Their son was born in July of 1875, on a Wednesday morning when the Kansas summer was at its most extravagant, and the heat had been unrelenting for a week. He was a healthy, furious, red-faced infant who announced his arrival at some volume, and who had, from the moment Della first held him, his father's coffee-dark eyes and her father's imperious chin. They named him Thomas Henry Chandler, Thomas for Albert's grandfather, Henry for Della's father, who had measured twice and cut once, and whose precision ran in the blood. Albert held Thomas for the first time with the same focused, deliberate care he brought to his instruments, as though the baby were something fragile and extraordinarily valuable, which of course he was, and Della watched him and felt a quality of happiness that had no useful comparison, the kind that sits quietly in your chest and simply exists. Thomas was 3 months old when Albert received a letter from the Texas General Land Office offering him a permanent position, not roving survey work, but a position as chief surveyor for a newly established regional office that the land office was opening in Fort Worth. A real office, a real salary, a real place to put down roots. Albert read the letter twice, folded it, and gave it to Della without comment. She read it, looked up at him, and said, "What do you want?" "I want to know what you think," Albert said. "I think," Della said carefully, "that you've been measuring other people's land for 6 years and you might want to think about whether you'd like some of your own." Albert looked at her. "Fort Worth is growing," Della said. "There's a market for a good dressmaker. There are schools being built. There's a real community taking shape." She paused. "But more importantly, what do you want, Albert? Not what's practical. What do you actually want?" Albert was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to stop moving." "Then write them back," Della said. He did. They moved to Fort Worth in the spring of 1876, when Thomas was approaching his first birthday and had developed strong opinions about solid food and a talent for pulling himself up on any piece of furniture within reach. The city was growing at a rate that felt almost physical, new buildings going up, new streets being laid out, the railroad pushing closer every year, bringing with it commerce and noise and the promise of connection to the larger world. Albert's office occupied 2 rooms on the main street, and within 6 months, he had built a reputation as the most reliable and scrupulously honest surveyor in North Texas, which was a reputation that attracted work the way a spring attracts travelers. Della opened a proper dressmaking shop 3 blocks from Albert's office, in a space that had good light and room for 2 sewing tables, and she hired a young woman named Rosa, newly arrived from San Antonio, who had nimble hands and a good eye, and who needed the work as badly as Della had once needed Me's $4 a month. She paid Rosa fairly, which was not the universal practice in Fort Worth or anywhere else, and treated her with the respect due a competent person, which Rosa returned with a loyalty and a skill that made the shop the best of its kind in the city within a year. Thomas grew with a speed that Albert said was mathematically unreasonable, and Della said was simply what children did if you fed them well and talked to them honestly. He had his father's deliberate attention and his mother's directness, an interesting combination in a small child that made him simultaneously the easiest and most exhausting person in the house. He called Albert Papa from the age of 12 months and followed him around the house with an intensity of devotion that Albert found both moving and slightly amusing. In the spring of 1878, Thomas was nearly 3 and entirely convinced that he could manage any situation that arose in his immediate vicinity, and Della was expecting their second child. She told Albert this time at dinner between the beans and the cornbread. She had eventually conceded that cornbread was better with molasses, which Albert had accepted with a grace that spoke well of his character, and Albert looked up from his plate with an expression that was now familiar, that wide, surprised happiness. "When?" he asked. "October, if my calculations are right." "They usually are," Albert said. "Yes," Della agreed. The autumn of 1878 brought their daughter, born on a mild October evening when the air had the smell of dry leaves and wood smoke, and she was a different creature from Thomas in every respect, quieter, more observant, more interested in watching the world before committing to an opinion about it. They named her Clara Rose Clara for a quality of brightness that she had from the very first, and Rose for me Gibbons, who had given them their start and who had been pleased beyond expression when she received the letter telling her so. Me had come up from Redemption Creek for the wedding and had visited twice since, and was entirely the wrong person to be anyone's proper godmother, and the perfect person for it in every way that mattered. Fort Worth in the late 1870s was a complicated place, full of the energy and ambition and injustice that characterized every boomtown on the frontier. Albert saw it clearly in his work. The way land was recorded and claimed, and in some cases taken from people who had no legal recourse, Mexican families whose grants went back generations, and whose records were ignored, freedmen who had worked their own plots since the end of the war, only to find that someone with better lawyers and more connections had recorded the same parcel in their own name. He saw it, and he was honest about what he saw, and when he could do something about it within the law, he did, correcting fraudulent surveys, documenting inconsistencies, making sure that the record reflected the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient for powerful people. It cost him some business and earned him some enemies, and Della was proud of him for it with a fierceness that she expressed practically, by maintaining the shop's income at a level that meant they were not dependent on any single source, by making sure their savings were solid, and by making it clear to anyone who suggested that Albert's principles were bad for business that they were welcome to take their business elsewhere. Thomas, at 5, asked his father why Mr. Hooper down the street was angry with him, because Thomas had heard the conversation through the office window and had the family talent for paying attention. Albert considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I told the truth about something," he said, "and the truth was inconvenient for him." Thomas considered this. "Should you have told a different truth?" "There's only one truth," Albert said. "Different versions of it aren't truth, they're convenience, and convenience isn't worth much in the long run." Thomas nodded with the solemn gravity of a 5-year-old who intends to remember this. Della, who had been listening from the doorway, went back to her sewing with the small, private smile she kept for moments when Albert was exactly himself. The years moved forward with the purposeful, uneven rhythm of a life that is actually being lived, full of small pleasures and moderate challenges, and the occasional significant difficulty, none of which broke them because they had built something that didn't break easily. Thomas started school and distinguished himself in mathematics, which surprised no one. Clara took her time with things, turned out to have a musical ear that nobody had anticipated, and commandeered the used upright piano Albert brought home from a furniture auction on a cold January morning in 1882 with a single-mindedness that was entirely her mother's. Me Gibbons came to stay for 3 weeks in the summer of 1881, driving up from Redemption Creek with a hired driver and bringing with her a case of preserves, 3 bottles of what she called medicinal whiskey, a basket of fresh bread that was still warm when she arrived, and an amount of goodwill that filled the house to its corners. She sat in the parlor with Della in the evenings and they talked for hours, the way women talk when they've earned each other's trust. And me told stories about Redemption Creek and Della told stories about Fort Worth, and Thomas periodically appeared to show me things he had built or discovered or calculated. And me greeted each of these presentations with the enthusiasm of a woman who understood that the child in front of her was showing her something important, and that it deserved to be treated as such. On the last evening of me's visit, they sat on the porch after supper, the children in bed, Albert inside reading, the warm night air soft with the sound of Fort Worth settling into itself, and me said, "You know what I thought when you came in off that stagecoach looking like you were going to take on the whole county with $11 and a small pistol." "What did you think?" Della asked. "I thought this girl is going to be all right," me said. "I had no idea how all right." Della looked out at the dark street and the lamplight from the other houses and the wide Texas sky above it all. "I had a good deal of help," she said. "You had yourself," me said firmly. Everything else was extra. Albert, who had come quietly to the doorway and heard the last part of this exchange, stayed where he was and said nothing, because it seemed like the right thing was to let it be what it was. In the spring of 1883, Albert purchased land. Not a great deal of it, 3 acres east of Fort Worth, good sandy loam with a water source. But it was his own, recorded in his own name in the office where he had spent 9 years ensuring that other people's land was recorded honestly. He showed Della the deed the evening he brought it home, and she held it with both hands and read it through in its entirety, which took a while because legal documents are long, and Albert sat across from her and watched her face. When she finished, she set the document down on the table and looked at him. "What are you going to do with it?" she said. "I thought we might build," Albert said. Della looked at the deed and then at him and said, "You want a house?" "I want a home," Albert said, "properly. On our own land." He paused. "It's taken me a while to understand the difference." Della reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I think you've known the difference for longer than you realize," she said. "I think you've just been working up to claiming it." Albert turned his hand over and held hers. "A man is slow sometimes about the things that matter most." "You were honest," Della said, "and thorough." As usual, she squeezed his hand. "I think that's more important." They built the house over the summer and fall of 1883, Albert doing much of the work himself with help from a local builder on the more technical elements, and Della made decisions about every room with the same combination of precision and practicality that characterized everything she did. The house had 4 rooms and a covered porch and a proper kitchen and a root cellar, and it sat on its 3 acres with a solidity that spoke of intention, of something meant to last. Thomas helped with what a 7-year-old can help with, which is more than adults generally anticipate and requires more supervision than anyone budgets for, and Clara supervised from a blanket in the shade with the authority of a 2-year-old who expects her opinions to be consulted on matters of consequence. They moved in on a cold November morning, carrying their things from the rented house in town, and that evening they ate supper at their own table in their own kitchen on their own land. And the children were tired and cross, and Albert burned the biscuits and Della laughed about it. And it was, by any conventional measure, a completely ordinary evening, and it was one of the best evenings of both their lives. The house on 3 acres became, over the following years, the kind of place that accumulates meaning, Not the grand, deliberate meaning of monuments, but the quiet, accidental meaning of a place where things happen, where people are genuinely themselves. Thomas grew up in that house and worked alongside his father during summers, learning the survey work with the same methodical patience. And Clara grew up in that house and played the piano in the evenings and read everything she could get her hands on with a thoroughness that would have made her grandfather proud. Della's shop continued to grow, and she took on a second assistant in 1884, a woman recently widowed who needed steady work and who turned out to be an outstanding embroiderer, which added an element to the shop's offerings that brought them custom from as far as Dallas. Albert's office handled an increasing portion of the land surveys for Tarrant County and the surrounding region, and he hired a young assistant of his own, a 20-year-old named James who had mathematical talent and the right kind of careful attention, and who reminded Albert enough of himself at that age that it made him both fond of the boy and fiercely determined to treat him well. In 1885, a letter came from Redemption Creek. It was from a woman who had been a neighbor of Me's, and who wrote to tell them that Me Gibbons had passed away peacefully in her sleep in early December, at the age of 62, in the rooms above the Silver Spur where she had lived and worked for 30 years. She had left the saloon to her bartender, Tom, with whom she had worked for 12 years, and she had left Della a box of things that was being shipped north on the next available freight wagon. The box arrived in February. It contained the shotgun that had lived under the bar, which Della recognized immediately with a wave of feeling she hadn't anticipated, a small brooch that had been Me's mother's, and a letter in Me's handwriting, short and direct in the way that Me was direct. The letter said, "You were the best thing that came through that door in 30 years, and that includes the piano. You and Albert and those children of yours are exactly what I would have wished for if I had been the wishing type, which you know I'm not. Don't mourn me too long. I have lived exactly the life I meant to live, which is all any of us can ask. Take care of yourself and that good man of yours. He deserves you and you deserve him, which is a rarer thing than people think. Me." Della read the letter at the kitchen table on a February afternoon, and Albert sat with her, and she cried the way she had not let herself cry on that first afternoon in Redemption Creek, honestly and without performance. And Albert held her hand and did not try to say anything, because there wasn't anything to say, and he knew it, and she loved him for it. She kept Me's letter in the box with the brooch and the rest of the things that mattered, and she wore the brooch to Thomas's school graduation in 1888, and to Clara's first public piano recital, and to her own shop's 10th anniversary, and to every occasion that seemed to warrant bringing something of Me Gibbons along for company. Thomas graduated from his school with the highest marks in mathematics that the teacher, a patient man named Mr. Alcott, said he'd seen in 15 years of teaching. He was 17, tall and lean like his father, with his mother's green eyes and his father's careful hands, and he had already decided, with the family's characteristic directness, that he intended to study engineering at the university in Austin and come back to Fort Worth and build things. He said this at dinner one evening as though he were reporting a fact rather than announcing a plan, which was so entirely both of his parents that Albert and Della exchanged a look over the supper table that was a full conversation in half a second. "I think that's exactly right," Albert said. "I think you should write to Austin next week," Della said. Thomas nodded. "I was planning to," he said. Clara, who was 9 and who had been watching this exchange with her usual observant patience, said, "Can I come to Austin too?" "In time," Della said. "How much time?" Clara asked. "Enough," Della said, which was her standard answer to questions whose timing she declined to commit to, and which Clara had long since learned to accept as a promise rather than a deferral. The spring of 1888 brought Albert his 50th, no, his 45th year, and Della his 38th, and they were in many ways the best years either of them had lived. The house was established and warm. The work was satisfying and solid. The children were themselves in the best possible way. And between Albert and Della, there was, after 15 years, a quality of partnership that had deepened past the first bright discovery of each other into something richer and more complex, a thing built from 10,000 ordinary moments. The coffee burned on a winter morning, the arguments about the best route to take on a Sunday drive, the evenings when they sat on the porch after the children were in bed and talked, or were silent in equal comfort. The times when one of them was frightened or tired or difficult, and the other one stayed, not because it was easy, but because staying was the whole point. Albert sometimes thought about Charlotte Marsh and felt nothing but a distant, almost amused gratitude, because if Charlotte had not made her extremely sensible choice, he would not have come west, would not have ended up in Redemption Creek, would not have sat at that corner table in the Silver Spur and been brought a plate of beef stew by a woman with copper hair and green eyes who told him, with complete lack of ceremony, that he was wrong about the molasses. He told Della this once on a porch evening, and she said, "I should write Charlotte Marsh a thank you letter." Albert laughed. "I'm serious," Della said. "She made an excellent decision." "For entirely different reasons," Albert said. "The reasons don't matter," Della said. "The outcome does." Thomas left for Austin in the fall of 1888, with his father's surveying compass in his bag as a talisman rather than a tool. He was going to build bridges, not measure land, but the compass had seemed the right thing to send him with, and a letter from his mother that contained, in 4 dense pages, everything she wanted him to know about being 24 years old in a city where nobody knew him. Thomas read the letter on the train and then read it again, and kept it in his coat pocket for the whole first semester, which was not something he told either of his parents. Clara, meanwhile, was developing into a young woman of formidable intelligence and considerable character, and she played the piano with a seriousness that had moved past amateur interest into something that looked like a genuine vocation. She was studying with a teacher in Fort Worth who had trained in Philadelphia, and who told Della with a directness that Della respected that Clara had a real gift, the kind that deserved serious attention. Della and Albert discussed this at length, the expense, the practicality, the question of what Clara actually wanted, and they concluded the discussion by asking Clara directly, which was the family way of doing things. Clara was 12 at the time of this conversation. She sat at the kitchen table and considered the question of whether she wanted to pursue serious musical training with the same steady deliberation her father brought to a new survey and her mother brought to a difficult alteration. Then she said, "Yes, but not because it's a vocation for a woman in society, because it's what I'm good at and what I want to do." Della and Albert exchanged the look. "Then we'll find a way," Della said. "Practically," Albert added, "which means we should talk to Mr. Hennessy about what that actually requires before we commit to anything." "Obviously," Clara said, with the family's characteristic precision. She was, in many ways, the combination of both of them, and if that was sometimes slightly overwhelming, it was overwhelmingly wonderful in all the ways that mattered. The last years of the 1880s moved with the feeling of a tide that has found its proper level, not still, because a real life is never still, but moving with a rightness that feels like arrival rather than passage. Albert was recognized by the Texas General Land Office in 1889 with a commendation for 15 years of accurate and honest work, the kind of recognition that doesn't come with fanfare, but means a great deal to a man who measures his worth in the reliability of his record. Della was asked to speak at a meeting of the Fort Worth Ladies Business Association about the practical management of a small commercial enterprise, and she did so with the direct, useful clarity that characterized everything she said, and 3 women in the audience left with notes they actually used. Thomas wrote home every month, letters full of the excitement of building things, of engineering drawings and material calculations, and the particular satisfaction of seeing a structure go from paper to stone. He was thriving. He was also, the family could read between the careful lines, beginning to be interested in a young woman named Alice, whose name appeared with increasing frequency in his letters, without ever being directly identified as anything other than a fellow student's sister and an interesting conversationalist. Della wrote back that interesting conversationalists were worth paying attention to, and to please tell them more about this person. Albert's letter on the same subject was shorter. He wrote, "Be honest with her from the start. It saves a great deal of time and is kinder to everyone. Thomas brought Alice home at Christmas of 1890. She was 20 years old, calm and bright, with the quality of listening carefully before speaking that Albert recognized in himself, and Della recognized as a good sign for reasons she could articulate precisely. She sat at the kitchen table the first morning and helped Della prepare breakfast without being asked, competently, and without making a production of it, and Della decided then that she liked Alice Martin very much. Clara, who was 14 and had strong opinions about most things, delivered her verdict on Alice within the first hour of meeting her. "She's sensible," Clara said to Della, "and she doesn't talk when she doesn't have something to say." "High praise," Della said. "It is," Clara agreed, completely sincerely. Thomas and Alice were married in Fort Worth in the summer of 1892, in a ceremony that Albert found he could not get through without the assistance of the handkerchief Della had put in his coat pocket specifically in anticipation of this, which she had done without mentioning it. When Albert found it at the necessary moment, he looked at Della sideways, and she kept her eyes forward with the composure of a woman who has planned ahead and is not going to apologize for it. Albert and Della's third decade together began with Thomas and Alice settled in Austin, where Thomas was building a name for himself in civil engineering, and Clara at 18 departing for a music conservatory in St. Louis, where she had been accepted on the basis of a recorded audition that her Fort Worth teacher had arranged. Della and Albert stood on the platform at the Fort Worth station and watched the train pull out, and Albert put his arm around Della's shoulders and she leaned into his side, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Della said, "She'll be perfectly fine." "I know," Albert said. "She's us," Della said. "She'll be more than fine." Albert kissed the top of her head. "Yes," he said, "she will." They went home to the house on the 3 acres, which was quieter than it had been in 20 years but not empty, because a house that has been properly lived in retains something of the life it has held, warmth in the walls, history in the floors, the particular density of a place where people have been genuinely present. They ate supper together in the kitchen and talked about Thomas's last letter and Clara's plans, and the survey work Albert had coming in the spring, and the order Della had from a Dallas family for a complete wardrobe for their eldest daughter's wedding. After supper, Albert cleared the table and Della made coffee, and they sat on the porch as the evening came in cool and clear over the Texas spring, the sky going from gold to deep blue with the thorough beauty of a place that has always had the best skies in the continent, and the stars beginning one by one, and the town settling into its night sounds, a dog, a wagon on the far street, the distant piano from someone's parlor window. "Albert," Della said. "Yes." "Do you remember the first time I told you that you were wrong about the molasses?" Albert made a sound that was the descendant of that wide, surprised laugh, older now, more comfortable with itself, but recognizably the same. "I remember," he said. "I was right," Della said. "You usually are," Albert said. "I know," Della said pleasantly. He reached over and took her hand on the arm of the porch chair, and she let her fingers interlace with his, and they sat there in the spring evening with their 20 years between them and the 3 acres around them and the house at their backs, and it was the particular happiness of 2 people who have made something good and know it, and are grateful for it without being confused about how it happened or what it cost or why it matters. In the summer of 1894, Thomas and Alice had their first child, a boy they named Henry Albert, Henry for Della's father, Albert for obvious and excellent reasons, and when the letter arrived telling them so, Albert read it at the breakfast table and then set it down and said nothing for a moment, and Della saw his face and reached over and put her hand on his arm without saying anything either, because sometimes the full weight of something is best honored in silence. They went to Austin in October to meet Henry Albert Chandler for the first time, traveling by rail on the line that had finally made the journey comfortable and relatively quick. Thomas met them at the station, and he was 30 years old and had his father's coffee eyes and his mother's chin, and the particular solidity of a man who knows what he is and what he's building. And Albert shook his hand at the platform, and then pulled him into an embrace that surprised both of them and was exactly right. Alice was well and Henry was, as Della reported to Clara in a letter written from the Austin boarding house that evening, absolutely the finest baby she had yet encountered, an opinion that she acknowledged was entirely unbiased. Clara came home from St. Louis for Christmas that year, returned for a visit rather than having finished her studies, because the conservatory was a 3-year program and she was only partway through. She was 20 years old and had grown into herself with a completeness that was satisfying to witness, confident without arrogance, curious without restlessness, possessed of a dry humor that was entirely her mother's and a quality of stillness that was entirely her father's. She played the piano on Christmas Eve in the parlor of the house on 3 acres, with Thomas and Alice and baby Henry and Albert and Della all gathered in the warm room. And she played Bach, and then she played a Texas fiddle tune she'd learned somewhere between the conservatory and home. And then she played, by request, a waltz, and Albert and Della danced in the parlor while their children watched, and it was the kind of moment that doesn't repeat itself and doesn't need to. The years after that were the years of consolidation, of a life that had found its form and was now living fully within it. Albert's survey work tapered as he entered his 50s, and he began to take on more supervisory and consultative work, reviewing records, training younger surveyors, occasionally giving evidence in land disputes as an expert whose credibility was unimpeachable because his record was exactly that. Della scaled the shop to a pace that suited her, keeping Rosa, who had been with her for nearly 20 years and who was now a partner in everything but legal name, and focusing on the bespoke work that interested her most. Clara finished the conservatory in 1896 and returned to Fort Worth, where she established a teaching practice and began giving public performances that drew audiences from across the region. She was, by any fair assessment, remarkable, not just skilled but genuinely musical, in possession of the quality that separates a competent performer from someone worth crossing the county to hear. She had suitors, and she considered them with her characteristic patience and precision, and she was in no hurry, and Albert and Della had the sense to say nothing about it except, when she asked, to say what they actually thought, which was that she would know when she knew, and rushing would only produce the wrong result. She met a man named David Park in the spring of 1898, a doctor who had come to Fort Worth from Ohio to establish a practice, and who was 32 years old and had, Clara told Della one evening, the quality of genuinely listening when she played. Not just politely attending, but actually listening. He hears it, Clara said, with the precision of someone reporting something that matters. He hears what I mean, not just what I'm playing. Della thought about a man who had once told her that she saw things he didn't see and said simply, "That's the one." Clara looked at her. "I think so too," she said. Clara and David Park were married in the autumn of 1898 in the Methodist Church in Fort Worth, and Della wore Me's brooch, and Albert danced with his daughter and managed the handkerchief without assistance this time, which he felt was a personal achievement. The house on the 3 acres had never been emptier or more full empty of the daily presence of children, and full of the accumulated weight of everything that had happened within its walls and on its porch, and at its kitchen table, and Albert and Della moved through it with the ease of people who have come to know a place so well it is an extension of themselves. On a Tuesday evening in June of 1899, 26 years after a dusty stagecoach had deposited Della Baker on the main street of Redemption Creek, Texas, with $11.40 and a loaded derringer and a heart full of stubborn hope. Albert and Della sat on the porch of their house as the evening came in, and the summer air was warm and smelled of the prairie and the horse in the small barn, and the roses that Della had planted along the porch railing the spring they moved in, and that had taken several years to establish themselves, and were now entirely at home. Thomas and Alice and young Henry, who was 5 now and already doing arithmetic that impressed his grandfather, were coming for supper on Saturday. Clara and David were coming Sunday. Clara with news that she'd shared only with Della, so far news that made Della's heart feel the same way it had felt when she'd held her own babies for the first time. That uncategorizable combination of wonder and gratitude, and the particular fullness of a life that has been well lived. Albert had brought home, that afternoon, a letter from the Texas Land Office. A young surveyor in a small town south of Abilene, facing a land dispute with a powerful local rancher, had written to the office asking for guidance, and the office had forwarded the letter to Albert as the most experienced and most reliably honest man in their records. The letter was carefully written and precise, and asked exactly the right questions, and Albert had read it twice with the expression Della recognized as the one he wore when he found something interesting. "You'll write back," Della said. "Tomorrow morning," Albert said. "First thing." "Good," Della said. "He'll need to know about the filing process and the importance of proper documentation before anyone interferes with the markers," Albert said. "And that backing down because someone is loud is not the same as being beaten," Della said. Albert looked at her with that expression, the one that was so familiar now it was like the porch itself, like the roses, like the particular way the evening light hit the 3 acres, entirely belonging to this life, to this person. "You should write him," he said. "We'll write him together," Della said. 2 points of view is better than 1. Different things get noticed." Albert smiled, not the surprised smile, not the wide, sudden one, but the deeper one, the quiet one that lived just behind everything else and came out in moments like this, moments of unceremonious rightness. "That's true," he said. "I usually am," Della said pleasantly. He reached over and took her hand on the porch railing, and the roses moved slightly in the evening air, and the horse made a sound in the barn, and somewhere in the house the clock ticked, and the stars were beginning, one by one, over the Texas sky that had always been the best sky in the continent. And they sat there together in the evening of a well-made life, Albert and Della Chandler, on the land they had measured and claimed and built upon, and there was nothing left undone, and nothing left unsaid, and nothing left to want that was not already, in the best and most complete sense of the word, exactly here.